those I protect, escaping the shadows of family.
Hey everyone! Welcome to Tell Me Reddit, the channel where we dive into the most interesting, dramatic, and unbelievable stories from Reddit. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support the content. It really helps us bring you more amazing stories. So sit back, relax, and let's jump into another incredible Reddit story.
I should have known better than to accept the invitation. Every year, my family gathered at my parents' house for Thanksgiving, and every year, I was reminded of just how much of a disappointment I was in their eyes. No husband, no children, just a career that they barely acknowledged and a cat they insisted made me a crazy cat lady. I used to believe that their barbs were just harmless jokes, but as the years passed, their words grew sharper, their whispers louder, their judgment heavier. This year was no different. As I walked through the front door, I was met with the usual chorus of greetings, some warm, most obligatory. The dining room was already set, the long oak table covered in steaming dishes that smelled like nostalgia. The scent of roasted turkey and spiced cider should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a trap. "Alice, you finally made it," my mother called from the kitchen. I was beginning to think work had swallowed you whole. "She doesn't have time for us," Aunt Margaret added, giving me a pointed look. "Too busy with those important meetings." I swallowed my irritation and smiled, hugging my mom before taking a seat. The conversation flowed as it always did, updates on pregnancies, engagements, school achievements. And then, like a slow-building storm, the attention turned to me. "So, Alice," my cousin Rebecca started, spearing a green bean with her fork, "any new prospects?" I sighed inwardly. "Nope, still just me." "That's such a shame," my grandmother clucked. "You'd make a wonderful mother. You're just too picky." "I'm really happy with where I am right now," I replied, forcing a smile. "Happy?" my uncle scoffed. "No one's really happy alone. Life is about family, children, legacy." A chorus of agreement followed, and I felt the heat creep up my neck. I had heard this all before, but tonight, their voices felt heavier, their disappointment more palpable. And then my sister, Laura, delivered the final blow. "Honestly, Alice, I don't get it," she said, swirling wine in her glass. "You're great with kids. You always babysat for me. It's like you're wasting yourself." I opened my mouth, ready to argue, when my gaze landed on the one empty seat at the table. A chair that should have been occupied by someone who wasn't even mentioned in passing. My nephew, Oliver. I hadn't seen Oliver in over a year. The last I heard, his mother, my cousin Emily, had run into trouble, but no one ever gave me details. And now, as I sat there, listening to my family harp on about how selfish I was for not having children, it dawned on me that not a single person had mentioned him. "Where's Oliver?" I asked, interrupting my aunt mid-sentence. The room went silent. My grandmother shifted in her seat. My mother busied herself with her napkin. Laura took another sip of wine. No one spoke. "Did something happen to him?" I pressed. A long pause. Then, finally, my father cleared his throat. "He's in foster care," he muttered. My stomach dropped. "What?" "Emily couldn't take care of him anymore," Aunt Margaret said with a sigh, as if discussing a misplaced set of keys. "It was too much for her, and none of us were in a position to take him in." I looked around the table, my mind racing. None of them had thought to tell me. They had abandoned him, pushed him out of their lives like he was an inconvenience, and now they were sitting here, feasting and laughing like he never existed. I pushed my chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "that while you all sit here and judge me for not having children, you let one of our own end up in the system?" "Now, Alice," my mother started, but I shook my head. "No," I snapped, standing. "You don't get to lecture me about family when you threw away a child like garbage." I didn't wait for their response. My pulse pounded in my ears as I grabbed my coat and stormed out. The night air was cold, but it did nothing to soothe the anger burning inside me. Oliver was alone. Forgotten. Cast aside. But not by me. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking, and typed his name into the search bar. If my family wouldn't take responsibility, then I would. I hit enter. And that was the moment everything changed. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Oliver alone in a sterile foster home, wondering why no one in his family had come for him. How had they let this happen? How had I let this happen? The next morning, I started digging. Oliver's mother, Emily, had always been the black sheep of the family. She had struggled with substance abuse and toxic relationships, but despite it all, she loved her son. At least, that's what I had always believed. But if she truly loved him, how could she have abandoned him? I searched online for any recent news about her, but there was nothing beyond a vague mention of an arrest a year ago. No details, no follow-up. It was like she had disappeared off the face of the earth. That in itself was strange. If Emily was in jail, wouldn't my family have mentioned it? If she had overdosed, wouldn't there have been an obituary? But there was nothing. Just silence. I called my mother. She answered on the third ring, her voice already wary. Alice, I need to know what happened to Oliver. A long pause. I told you, Emily couldn't take care of him anymore. That's not an answer, I snapped. Where is she? Why didn't you tell me he was in foster care? Another pause. Then, a carefully measured response. It wasn't your problem to deal with. The words sent a chill through me. Not my problem? He's family. Alice, let it go. It's better this way. Click. She had hung up on me. That only fueled my determination. If my family wanted to keep their secrets, they could go ahead and try. But I was going to find out the truth with or without them. I called every foster agency I could find in our county. Most wouldn't give me any information, citing privacy laws, but after hours of persistence, I finally got lucky. A tired-sounding caseworker named Linda confirmed that Oliver was in the system. Are you a relative? She asked. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm his aunt. There was a pause, then the sound of her typing. His file says no family members expressed interest in taking him in. Are you looking to change that? My heart clenched. Yes, I am. She hesitated. If that's the case, you'll need to go through the proper channels. There's an application process, background checks, home visits. I'll do whatever it takes, I interrupted. Please, just tell me where he is. A sigh. I can't give you his exact location, but I can set up a supervised visit. Another pause. Are you sure about this? It's not easy taking in a child, especially one who's been through what Oliver has. I stiffened. What do you mean? What has he been through? More typing. Then, that's something Oliver will have to tell you himself. I closed my eyes, my grip on the phone tightening. When can I see him? 2 days later, I walked into the foster center, my stomach knotted with anxiety. The building was drab, the walls covered in posters about child welfare and trauma counseling. A receptionist led me to a small visitation room with a round table and plastic chairs. And then, the door opened. Oliver stepped inside, looking smaller than I remembered. He was 10 now, but he had the posture of someone much older, shoulders hunched, eyes wary. His dark brown hair was longer than before, hanging in his face, and his clothes looked a size too big. But it was his expression that shattered me. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked cautious, like he didn't trust that I was really there. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Hey, kiddo. He didn't respond. Just stood there, watching me like I was another adult about to let him down. I gestured to the chair across from me. You want to sit? He hesitated, then slowly moved forward, sliding into the chair. His eyes flicked toward the door, as if measuring the distance in case he needed to bolt. Do you remember me? I asked. He nodded once. Aunt Alice. Hearing him say my name nearly broke me. I forced a smile. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I didn't know. Silence. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, they told me nobody wanted me. A sharp pain stabbed through my chest. That's not true, I said firmly. That's not true at all. His fingers curled into fists on the table. Then why did they leave me? I had no answer. Because I didn't know. Because my family, our family, had abandoned him without a second thought. And I was going to find out why. But before I could say anything, Oliver looked up at me, his brown eyes dark with something that sent a chill through me. "Aunt Alice," he whispered. "Do you know what happened to my mom?" The air in the room felt heavy. I swallowed. "No, Oliver. I don't. But I'm going to find out." His lips pressed together. He looked down at his hands. "She told me a secret before she left," he said quietly. "A bad secret?" My pulse quickened. "What kind of secret?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the door again, as if someone might be listening. And then, in the smallest voice, he said, "She told me our family did something terrible." Oliver's words echoed in my mind long after I left the foster center. "She told me our family did something terrible." I couldn't shake the weight of that sentence, the way his voice had dropped to a whisper, as if he was afraid that merely speaking the words would summon something dark. I didn't know what my family had done, but I was going to find out. The first step was getting Oliver out of there. The following week was a blur of phone calls and paperwork. I met with Linda, the caseworker, who laid out the legal labyrinth I'd have to navigate to gain guardianship. "It won't be easy," she warned. "You'll have to prove stability, financial capability, emotional readiness, and that's assuming no one in your family contests it." The last part gave me pause. Would they fight me on this? Would they care enough to try? I doubted it. "I'll do whatever it takes," I told her, and I meant it. 2 days later, I was approved for another visit, this time, an off-site trip to a local park. It was meant to be casual, a way for Oliver and me to reconnect outside the confines of the foster system's walls. But nothing about that day felt casual. Oliver sat stiffly on the bench beside me, his small hands gripping a juice box like it was his only anchor in the world. He barely touched the sandwich I had packed, only nibbling at the edges before pushing it aside. His gaze flickered around the park, watching other children play, but he made no move to join them. "Do you remember coming here with your mom?" I asked gently. His fingers tightened around the juice box. "A little. She used to push you on the swings until you were laughing so hard you could barely breathe." Something in his expression shifted, just a flicker of something raw before he clamped it down. "Yeah." I hesitated before asking the question that had been gnawing at me since our last visit. "Oliver, what did you mean when you said our family did something terrible?" His shoulders went rigid. For a long time, he didn't speak. I started to think he wouldn't answer at all. But then, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it, he said, "Mom told me not to trust them. That they lied. That they did something bad and made her keep quiet about it." I swallowed hard. "Did she tell you what they did?" He shook his head. "She said she would tell me when I was older. But then, she disappeared." The word sent a chill down my spine. "Disappeared?" He nodded. "One day, she was just gone. The police said she ran away, but she wouldn't do that. She promised she wouldn't leave me." I exhaled slowly, my mind spinning. Emily had been struggling, but she had loved Oliver. I knew that much. And now she was missing? The family never mentioned that. They acted like she had simply fallen off the map, but Oliver clearly believed otherwise. "Do you think someone hurt her?" I asked carefully. He didn't answer. He just looked up at me, his brown eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Fear. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen, the glow illuminating the scattered papers and notes I had started compiling. If my family was hiding something, I needed to start from the beginning. I typed Emily's name into every database I could find. Social media, missing persons reports, news articles. But there was almost nothing. It was like she had been erased. Frustrated, I dug deeper. If she had been arrested, there would be records. But there weren't. If she had left voluntarily, there would be bank transactions or travel logs. But there weren't. And then I found something. An old news article, buried deep in an online archive, dated nearly a year ago. It wasn't about Emily directly, but about a house fire in the next town over. The house had belonged to a man named Richard Halston. A man who, according to the article, had been Emily's employer. A man who had died in that fire. A man who had been under investigation for fraud and embezzlement before his sudden death. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding. None of this made sense. Why hadn't my family mentioned this? Why had Emily vanished right after this happened? I reached for my phone before I could second-guess myself. I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. I dialed Laura's number. She picked up on the third ring. Alice? What do you want? I want to know what happened to Emily. Silence. Then, in a voice colder than I'd ever heard from my sister, she said, "Drop it, Alice. This isn't something you want to dig into." And then she hung up. Laura's words echoed in my mind long after she hung up. This isn't something you want to dig into. That wasn't just a dismissal, it was a warning. And if there was one thing I refused to do, it was back down when someone told me to drop something. Especially when it involved Oliver. Especially when it involved Emily vanishing into thin air after the death of her employer. I needed more information. And I knew exactly where to start. The next morning, I drove straight to my parents' house, fueled by caffeine and determination. The moment my mother opened the door and saw me standing there, her smile faltered. "Alice," she said, her voice tense. "What are you doing here? We need to talk." I pushed past her into the house before she could protest. The familiar scent of cinnamon candles and lemon cleaner filled my nose, but it didn't bring me comfort like it used to. "About what?" she asked, closing the door behind me. I turned to face her. "Emily." She flinched, just barely, but I caught it. "Alice, we've been over this. Emily made her choices. She wasn't stable. And yet, she was stable enough to raise Oliver for years before suddenly disappearing." I folded my arms. What really happened to her? "And don't lie to me." My mother sighed, rubbing her temples. "She got involved with the wrong people. She was reckless, impulsive. She ran with criminals. That fire was ruled accidental," I cut in. "But that doesn't mean it was. And it doesn't explain why she vanished afterward." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "We tried to help her. We really did. But some people don't want to be saved, Alice. You can't rewrite history just because you feel guilty." Guilty. The word stung. "You let Oliver end up in foster care without telling me," I said, my voice sharp. "And now you're trying to pretend that Emily was just some lost cause?" "I don't believe you." Her eyes darkened. "Be careful, Alice. Sometimes the truth isn't what you want it to be." That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the notes I had scribbled across my kitchen table. Emily's disappearance. Oliver's cryptic words. The fire that killed Richard Halston. My family's insistence that I stop looking. I knew there was more to this. And I needed help. I called Linda, Oliver's caseworker. "I want to start the guardianship process," I told her. "Officially." She hesitated. "Alice, I have to be honest with you. Oliver's case is complicated. Your family didn't just ignore him. They actively fought to keep him in the system." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when the state reached out to relatives for placement, your parents and several other family members told them Oliver would be better off with strangers. That he wasn't their responsibility." I felt sick. "They really said that?" "Yes. And now that you're trying to take him in, they might fight you on it. You need to be prepared." A cold fury settled in my chest. Let them try. 2 days later, I met with a lawyer. I had no idea what I was up against, but I wasn't going to let Oliver slip through the cracks. "Your case is strong," my lawyer, Daniel, told me. "But if your family contests it, we're looking at a battle. Courts tend to favor stable placements, and if they argue that you're acting emotionally rather than practically, they could make things difficult." "I don't care," I said. "He's my nephew. He deserves better than foster care." Daniel nodded. "Then we start the paperwork. But be ready, your family won't take this lying down." And he was right. Because 2 days after I filed the petition, I got a call from Laura. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she hissed the second I answered. What I should have done a long time ago, I shot back. "Taking care of Oliver." Mom is furious. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "Then why don't you enlighten me?" I challenged. "What are you all so afraid of? What's the big family secret that no one wants me to find out?" Silence. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she said, "Alice, if you keep digging, you're going to regret it." The line went dead. Laura's warning clung to me like a shadow. If you keep digging, you're going to regret it. But I had already come too far. Regret or not, I needed answers. The next morning, I requested a copy of the police report from the fire that killed Richard Halston. It took hours of navigating red tape, but finally, I had the document in my hands. Sitting in my car outside the county clerk's office, I flipped through the pages, scanning for anything unusual. And then I found it. Buried in the report was a statement from an anonymous source, someone who had called in a tip before the fire even started. They had claimed that Richard Halston was in danger, that someone was going to silence him. But the report ended abruptly with no follow-up. No investigation. I felt a chill creep up my spine. The fire had been ruled accidental, but what if it wasn't? What if Emily had known something? What if that's why she disappeared? I needed to talk to someone who knew Richard Halston personally. And I knew exactly where to start. That evening, I found myself outside a small, rundown bar on the outskirts of town. According to my research, this was where Halston had done most of his business. If anyone had insight into what really happened to him, it would be the people who drank here. I stepped inside, the scent of cheap beer and stale cigarettes hitting me instantly. The bartender barely glanced at me as I slid onto a stool. "Looking for someone?" he asked, wiping down the counter. "I'm looking for information," I said. "About Richard Halston." The bartender's movements stilled. He eyed me warily. "And who might you be?" "A concerned family member," I said vaguely. "I just need to know what really happened to him." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a sigh, he nodded toward the back of the bar. "You'll want to talk to Benny. He knew Halston better than most." I turned to see an older man nursing a glass of whiskey in the corner. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp despite the alcohol. I approached cautiously. "Are you Benny?" He glanced up, his gaze raking over me. "Depends who's asking. I need to know about Richard Halston. About the fire. And about Emily." His expression darkened. "Emily? You related to her. She's my cousin. And she's missing." Benny sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Damn shame. I figured something bad happened to her." My heart pounded. "Why? What do you know?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Halston was mixed up in some bad business. He had dirt on a lot of people, your family included. Emily got too close. She must have found out something she wasn't supposed to." I swallowed hard. "And you think that's why she disappeared?" He nodded. "Wouldn't be the first time someone who crossed your family just vanished." My stomach twisted. "Who else?" Benny gave me a hard look. "You really want to know?" I hesitated. Then I nodded. He exhaled slowly, taking a sip of his whiskey. "There was a guy years ago. Accountant, I think. He worked for your uncle. Found some discrepancies in the books, started asking too many questions. Next thing you know, he skips town. Or at least, that's the story your family tells. No one's seen him since." I felt sick. My family had always been secretive, but this was something else. This was calculated. "You're saying my family had something to do with Richard Halston's death? With Emily's disappearance?" Benny shrugged. "All I'm saying is, your cousin knew something. And if I were you, I'd be careful where I start poking around. People who ask too many questions don't always like the answers they get." I left the bar feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. My family, my own flesh and blood, had been covering up something dark for years. And now, they were trying to keep me from finding out the truth. But I wasn't backing down. When I got home, I found Oliver waiting for me, sitting on my couch with his knees pulled to his chest. "Hey," I said gently. "What's wrong?" He hesitated, then whispered, "They came to see me." My blood ran cold. "Who?" "Grandma. Aunt Laura. They told me I should stop talking to you. That you're going to make things worse." Rage burned through me. "Did they say anything else?" Oliver bit his lip. "They said that if you don't stop, something bad will happen." I clenched my fists. They were threatening me now. Trying to scare Oliver. Trying to make us back down. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Listen to me, Oliver," I said, crouching in front of him. "I am not going anywhere. No matter what they say. No matter what they do. I'm going to protect you." And I'm going to find out what happened to your mom. Tears welled in his eyes. You promise? I took his small hand in mine and squeezed. I promise. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. Threats didn't scare me. But the idea of my family intimidating Oliver, that was something else entirely. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept replaying his voice. They told me I should stop talking to you. That you're going to make things worse. They were trying to shut him up. Which meant Oliver knew something, even if he didn't realize it yet. The next morning, I drove him to school, watching his small frame disappear through the doors before I pulled out my phone and dialed Linda, his caseworker. I need to file a complaint, I told her. His grandmother and aunt are trying to manipulate him. Linda sighed. That's going to be tricky. Unless they make a direct threat or interfere with the case, there's not much we can do legally. But I'll make a note of it. That's not good enough, I snapped. They're scaring him. I know, she said, her tone gentler now. But we need proof. Keep documenting everything. And if they cross a line, we'll act. I exhaled sharply. Fine. But I'm not letting them near him again. I spent the rest of the day diving deeper into my family's secrets. I called in a favor with an old college friend who worked in investigative journalism. She had access to records I didn't, and within a few hours, she sent me something that made my blood run cold. Bank statements. Transfers of large sums of money from my uncle's business, some of it to shell corporations, others to offshore accounts. And then one name jumped out at me, Richard Halston. The same Richard Halston who died in a fire. The same Richard Halston who had been under investigation before his sudden death. I stared at the documents, my heart pounding. Emily had worked for Halston. If she had access to these records, if she knew what was going on, that's why she disappeared. She must have found out about the money laundering. She must have confronted the wrong person. And now she was gone. That evening, I sat Oliver down at the kitchen table. Oliver, I said gently, I need you to think really hard. Before your mom left, did she ever mention anything about your grandpa or Uncle David? Did she seem scared of them? His face scrunched up. I don't know. She was always careful about what she said. But what? He fidgeted with his hands. One night, I heard her on the phone. She was whispering, and she sounded really scared. I think she was talking to someone about money. She kept saying, I can't do this anymore. It's too dangerous. And then she said. He hesitated, looking at me with wide, uncertain eyes. Oliver, whatever it is, you can tell me. He swallowed hard. She said, they killed him, and I'm next. My stomach lurched. Did she say who? Who they killed? He shook his head. I don't know. But she left the next day. Everything clicked into place. My family wasn't just covering up a crime. They were covering up a murder. And now I was next in line to uncover the truth. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called Laura. Alice, what the hell? Cut the crap, Laura, I interrupted. I know about the money laundering. I know about Halston. And I know Emily knew something she wasn't supposed to. Silence. Then, her voice dropped to a whisper. You need to stop. No. You need to start talking. What did she know? Who did she think they killed? Alice. Tell me. She exhaled shakily. You don't understand. It's bigger than you think. Uncle David. He's not the one pulling the strings. I gripped the phone tighter. Then who is? Another silence. Then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, she said. Dad. My heart stopped. What? Dad was the one handling the money. He was the one working with Halston. And when Halston got sloppy, when the investigation started, Dad made sure he wouldn't talk. I felt like the room was spinning. Are you telling me Dad, our father, killed him? I don't know, she whispered. But I know Emily did. My breath caught in my throat. What? Emily killed Halston. She was the one who started the fire. And Dad helped her cover it up. I dropped the phone. My hands were shaking. Oliver's mom, my cousin, had been running for her life because she had killed a man. And my father had helped her do it. I had spent my whole life believing my family was cruel, manipulative, and secretive. I never thought they were capable of murder. And if they had killed for this once, they could do it again. I needed to protect Oliver. And I needed to get us out. I had to get Oliver out. After Laura's revelation, my entire world felt like it had collapsed under me. My father, the man who had raised me, who had sat at the head of the Thanksgiving table year after year, had been involved in money laundering. He had helped cover up a murder. And now I was certain he was willing to do anything to keep that secret buried, including getting rid of anyone who threatened to expose it. The first thing I did was call Linda, Oliver's caseworker. "Linda, I need to move Oliver immediately," I said, my voice barely steady. "He's not safe." She hesitated. "Alice, you're asking me to override an entire legal process. Do you have proof of an immediate danger?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her everything. But I knew that without concrete evidence, my word alone wouldn't be enough. "I have a bad feeling," I said instead. "They're trying to intimidate him. My father and Laura already threatened him, and I don't know what they'll do next." She sighed. "I'll see what I can do, but these things take time. If there's an immediate threat, you need to go to the police." The police. The very system my family had managed to manipulate for years. I hung up and made my decision. I wasn't waiting. That night, I packed a bag for Oliver. I told him we were going on a trip, and he didn't question it. He had seen the fear in my eyes, the way I kept checking the windows, flinching at every unexpected sound. He just nodded and grabbed his jacket. We left in the middle of the night. I didn't tell anyone where we were going. I drove for hours, heading toward the state border. My plan was simple: get far enough away that my family couldn't find us, then figure out the next step. I had money saved, enough to rent a motel for a while. I didn't know what I was going to do beyond that, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let Oliver end up like his mother. We stopped at a gas station just outside of town. As I filled up the tank, Oliver sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, silent as ever. Then, as I screwed the gas cap back on, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A black SUV, parked a few rows away. A figure inside, watching me. My heartbeat roared in my ears. It could have been nothing. It could have been coincidence. Or it could have been them. I got back in the car and pulled away from the station as calmly as I could. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, my worst fears were confirmed. The SUV followed. "Aunt Alice." Oliver's voice was small. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart," I lied. "Just sit tight." I took a sharp turn down a side road, then another. The SUV stayed behind us, matching my every move. "Hold on," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. I floored it. The car roared forward, tires screeching against the pavement as I weaved through empty backroads. The SUV kept up, but I had one advantage: I knew these roads. I had grown up in this town. A few more sharp turns, a detour down a narrow gravel path, and suddenly, the headlights behind me disappeared. I kept driving for another 20 minutes before pulling over in a secluded area, my hands shaking against the wheel. "Aunt Alice." Oliver's voice was small. "Who were they?" I turned to him, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "No one we have to worry about anymore." But I knew I was lying. We weren't safe. Not yet. I found a motel on the outskirts of the next town over. Paid in cash. Checked in under a fake name. Once inside, I double-locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Oliver sat on the bed, looking smaller than ever. "Are we gonna be okay?" I crouched in front of him, taking his hands in mine. "Yes, I promise." But I didn't know if I was telling the truth. Because if my father had found us once, he could find us again. And I had a sinking feeling he wasn't done yet. We didn't sleep that night. I kept my ears trained on every sound outside our motel room, every car passing by, every footstep on the pavement. My father had found us once. He would find us again. It was only a matter of time. I needed to act first. At sunrise, I made a decision. I was done running. I called my lawyer, Daniel. "I need your help. Now." He sighed heavily. "Alice, do you have any idea what you're up against? If what you're saying is true, your family has deep ties. They won't just let you walk into court and take Oliver." "Then we don't go through court," I said. We go public. Silence. Then, that's dangerous. So is waiting for them to come after us again. I need to blow this open. I have evidence, financial records, the connection to Halston, my father's involvement in the cover-up. If we leak this, they won't be able to touch us without bringing even more attention to themselves. Daniel exhaled sharply. Do you have somewhere safe to go? A secure location. I glanced at Oliver, who was still curled up on the motel bed, his small frame rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Not yet. Find one. I'll start making calls. But Alice, once this is out, there's no going back. I knew that. And I was ready. I packed up everything and checked out of the motel, paying in cash again. Oliver was silent as I drove. He must have sensed the shift in my energy, the determination, the weight of what was coming. Aunt Alice, he finally whispered. Are we going to win? I forced a smile. Of course we are. But in my gut, I wasn't sure. I drove us straight to the local news station. Daniel had pulled a few strings and set up a meeting with an investigative journalist named Claire Whitmore. She was known for exposing corruption, and she wasn't afraid of powerful people. We met in the back of a coffee shop, away from prying eyes. Claire was sharp, her gaze flicking between me and Oliver as I laid out everything: my father's involvement, the missing money, Emily's disappearance. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, letting out a low whistle. You realize what you're doing, right? If I run the story, your family won't just sit back and let it happen. They'll fight. Hard. I know, I said. But they won't be able to silence all of us. If this gets out, they'll have to answer for what they did. Claire nodded slowly. All right. Give me everything you have. I'll start digging. But Alice, be careful. People who expose families like yours don't always come out unscathed. I swallowed hard. I don't care what happens to me. I just need Oliver to be safe. We left the coffee shop with a plan. Claire would start pushing the story through media channels, and Daniel would file an emergency motion for Oliver's guardianship, citing the potential danger he was in. It was risky, but it was our best shot. And then my phone rang. My father. I hesitated before answering. What do you want? Alice, he said, his voice calm. Too calm. Come home. Let's talk. I have nothing to say to you. I think you do. A pause. You're making a mistake. No, Dad. The mistake was thinking I wouldn't find out. Thinking I wouldn't fight back. His voice hardened. You're putting Oliver in danger. You don't understand what you're dealing with. I clenched my jaw. I understand perfectly. And soon, so will everyone else. A long silence. Then, chillingly soft, he said, You always were the difficult one. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my pulse thudding in my ears. Aunt Alice. Oliver's small voice pulled me back. He was watching me, wide-eyed, nervous. I forced my breathing to steady. It's okay, kiddo. We're almost there. But deep down, I knew the war had just begun. The story broke the next morning. Claire had worked fast. The news report detailed everything: my father's financial crimes, his connection to Richard Halston, the suspicious circumstances surrounding Emily's disappearance. She had even managed to track down an old police officer who admitted, off the record, that the fire had always seemed a little too convenient. My father's name was plastered across headlines, his image flashing across every local news station. The whispers about his business dealings turned into a roar. And then, like vultures smelling blood, the authorities finally took interest. By noon, the FBI had raided my father's office. The state filed an injunction freezing his assets. My Uncle David had already lawyered up, and my mother, who had been silent this entire time, was nowhere to be found. I should have felt victorious. But I didn't, because Oliver was still in limbo. Linda called me that afternoon. Alice, there's something you need to know. My heart sank at her tone. What? Your father filed an emergency petition for custody of Oliver. He's claiming you abducted him. He wants him placed into state care until the case is sorted. I gripped the phone tighter. He's trying to separate us. Yes. And with everything happening, the court may listen. They'll claim Oliver's safer with neutral guardians while the investigation plays out. I closed my eyes, rage building in my chest. They don't care about Oliver. They just want to shut me up. Linda hesitated. There's more. Your father's lawyers are pushing for a restraining order against you. If they succeed, you won't be able to see Oliver at all. Cold panic gripped me. No, they can't. You need to fight this, Alice. If they win, it could be months before you see him again. Maybe longer. I swallowed the lump in my throat. What do I do? You need to be at the courthouse tomorrow. And you need to be ready to prove that Oliver belongs with you. I had spent weeks fighting my family's lies. Tomorrow, I would have to win. That night, Oliver crawled into bed beside me. Are they going to take me away? He whispered. I wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close. No, I won't let them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he whispered, Mom said the same thing before she left. My chest ached. I'm not your mom, Oliver. I won't disappear. I swear. He pressed his face against my shoulder. I don't want to go back. I kissed his hair. You won't. But I wasn't sure if that was a promise I could keep. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse, my lawyer by my side. My father was already there, flanked by his legal team, his face a mask of calm control. My mother sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, looking down at the floor. Laura was nowhere to be seen. The hearing started, and the judge listened as both sides presented their case. My father's lawyers painted me as an unstable woman with a vendetta, someone who had unlawfully removed a child from a stable environment. They called my actions reckless and emotionally motivated. I wanted to scream. Then it was my turn. Daniel stood and laid everything out, how Oliver had been abandoned, how my father had ignored his existence until I stepped in, how my family had threatened him, how he had no one else who truly cared about him. Then, to my surprise, Linda stood up. Your Honor, she said, her voice firm. I have personally handled Oliver's case. Alice is the only member of his family who has shown any effort to care for him. The only person advocating for his future. If he is removed from her custody, I have no doubt that he will suffer for it. The judge leaned back in his chair, looking between both parties. The courtroom was silent as we waited for his decision. I've reviewed the evidence, he finally said. And while this case is complicated, one thing is clear. Oliver deserves stability. A home. A guardian who prioritizes him above all else. He turned to me. Alice Bennett, I am granting you full legal guardianship of Oliver Walker, effective immediately. I barely heard the rest. My father's face turned to stone, his hands clenched at his sides. I felt his fury, but I didn't care. I had won. Oliver was mine. As we left the courthouse, Oliver's small hand slipped into mine. We did it. I squeezed his fingers. Yeah, kiddo. We did it. But as we walked out the doors, I felt the weight of my father's gaze burning into my back. This wasn't over. Not yet. Winning in court should have meant the end. It should have been the moment I could finally breathe, finally let my guard down. But my father wasn't done with me yet. The night after the court ruling, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. My heart pounded as I reached for it, half expecting another threat from my father. But it wasn't him. It was Laura. Her voice was frantic. Alice, you need to get out of the house. Now. I bolted upright. What? Why? Dad's not going to let this go. He's furious. He said something, Alice. He said you shouldn't have won if you weren't prepared to lose. Chills ran down my spine. Lose what? I don't know, she whispered. But I think he's coming for you. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Oliver, still half asleep, and rushed him into the car. My hands were shaking as I drove, constantly checking the mirrors, heart pounding so hard it hurt. We didn't go back to the motel. We didn't go anywhere predictable. Instead, I drove to Claire's house. She answered the door in pajamas, blinking at me in confusion. Alice? I need a safe place, I gasped. Please. Just for tonight. She didn't ask questions. She just stepped aside and let us in. The next morning, I woke up to the news. Prominent businessman under federal investigation found dead in apparent suicide. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the words. My father was dead. A gunshot wound. A note found in his office. A confession of his crimes, embezzlement, bribery, obstruction of justice. But nothing about Halston. Nothing about Emily. Just enough to make him seem guilty without unraveling the deeper truth. Just enough to make it look like he had ended it all. But I knew better. Laura called me again later that day. You know it wasn't him, right? I swallowed. Yeah, I know. Someone had silenced him before he could talk. Someone higher up. Someone who had wanted to make sure the truth never came out. What do we do now? Laura asked. I looked at Oliver, playing quietly with a book in Claire's living room. He had already lost so much. I wasn't going to let him lose anything else. We move on, I said. We take Oliver and we build a life. A good one. And the truth. I closed my eyes. The truth is still out there. But some battles aren't worth fighting. Not when I had already won the most important one. Oliver was safe. And that was all that mattered. Months passed. We moved to a new city where no one knew our names. Where Oliver could start fresh. Where I could finally breathe. Sometimes I still looked over my shoulder. Sometimes I still wondered who had really pulled the strings behind my father's downfall. Sometimes I still thought about Emily, where she might be if she was even alive. But then I'd look at Oliver, laughing as he ran through the park, and I knew the only thing that mattered was the future. Not the past. The past had already buried itself. And I wasn't going to dig it up again. The end.